And what does the Bible say about Antichrist? We started a portion in this to get into the book of Daniel. I tried to point out the fact that Israel were a special bunch of people. They were a nation that didn't come necessarily from the loins of Adam and Eve, as in procreation, and they just worked their way through, and then to Noah, and then to Japheth and Ham and Shem, and so on and so forth. God had a plan for a supernatural nation. Supernatural in the sense that Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90 when they brought forth the child. Supernatural in that they had faith for it. And God brought a nation out of that by faith. And God had intended that this nation would stand above all nations in the world as an example. Or as we said last week, as a diadem, and it's sort of the crown jewel of all nations. So the Bible says these are the families of the sons of Noah after their generation in their nation. And by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So God divided the nations at the Tower of Babel. He split them up and gave them languages so that they couldn't do what Nimrod had tried to do, which was pull them all together, and he was a leader against God. And he tried to unify them as a global entity against God. And God said, can't do that. So he confused them, gave them nationality as opposed to globalism. He gave them nationality. But when he was giving the nations their boundaries and containing them, he had Israel in mind. He had a nation of faith down the road in mind. So it says here, and when the Most High divided the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set bounds to the people according to the number of the children of Israel. Or in other words, when he separated and dispersed them, he was thinking about Israel when he did that too. He was thinking about this nation that would come out of the nations, or from among the nations, that would be unique to the rest because they would have been birthed by faith. And so he divided. He put all the other nations on a boundary, on a leash, so to speak, knowing that this nation was to come forth. In Leviticus 25 we read, God kept a piece of real estate for himself. And the land shall not be sold forever, he said. For the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. And so he tells the children of Israel, this, when they eventually came about, this piece of real estate belongs to me. I kept it. When I put the nations out there, when I put boundaries to all the nations, I kept this place for you. I knew you were coming, and I planned it before the foundation of the earth. I had a plan. You were to come, you were to be the example to all nations. Although all nations were under sin because of Adam, you would be a nation different from the rest because you would have a covenant with the Almighty God, and therefore I could bless you and minister to you and through you, and the rest of the world would see it. The rest of the world were worshiping many gods, trying to find spiritual fulfillment, but you would have one God. They would stand different from all other nations because they had one God. And so God said, this real estate you're on is mine. He also went then to a guy called Abraham in Ur of the Chaldees, and he offered Abraham this covenant. And he took it. It says, and the Lord now said unto Abraham, get thee out of your country, from your kindred, from the father's house, onto a land that I will show thee. This land, this piece of real estate, was God's. He said, and I will make thee a great nation. So here, God was automatically and already thinking that even though he had a covenant with Abraham, he had a nation in mind. He said, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you'll be a blessing. And I'll bless them that bless you, I'll curse them that curse you, and in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So God was already thinking nations when he talked to Abraham, even though he was only one individual. So he takes this man, Abraham, covenants with him, and he takes him from Ur of the Chaldees, which was over in Babylonia. And the guy marched a 1,000-mile trek, basically, over a period of time. But he trekked that 1,000 miles from Ur, near Babylon, and he went in an ark, and it's called the Fertile Crescent, where the river Euphrates runs, and so on and so forth. And so he went round and he came to Shechem, is where he came. He settled there in the land of Canaan. But when God called him, God had nations in mind, and he put him on this particular piece of real estate that God said was his. And that was his journey. And he headed off from Ur of the Chaldeans, and I did put a square around this piece of real estate that God held for himself among all nations. God said, this is mine. So he took this man Abraham, and he sort of went on that journey. He went up to Haran and came back, and eventually he came to Shechem, and he settled there. Him and Lot and Abraham's wife Sarah. So they settled there. And this piece of real estate belonged to God, but he had intended that this piece of real estate would house a nation that would stand out among all nations. God told them here that they would be unique. They weren't an ordinary nation. It says, and from the top of the rocks I see, and this is when Balaam went to curse the children of Israel. Remember that story? And so Balaam says this under the inspiration of the Spirit of God. He says, and from the top of the rocks I see him, and from the hills I behold him. Lo, the people shall dwell alone, and shall not be reckoned among the nations. Balaam, when he looked at Israel, said, you know what? They're not an ordinary nation. You can look at all the other nations of the world and sort of talk about them as the global nations of the world. But this one nation is unique. This nation shall not be reckoned among the nations. This nation is special. This nation is mine. So that's what we call it. As we said about them. They were special. They stood out from all other nations. This piece of real estate back here, where this nation was unique to everywhere else in the world, because God had a people here that were a nation that weren't really to be reckoned among other nations, because they were different. It says here in Exodus 19:5, God again speaking to the children of Israel, says, now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, if you will keep my covenant, then you will be a peculiar treasure unto me above all peoples. You're going to be unique. You're going to be different than everybody else. I've got a plan and a purpose for you. You're a nation that came about by a man agreeing to covenant with me, and a man and a woman who had a child by faith. So they had Isaac and Jacob had kids, and those 12 kids went on to be the nation of Israel. So that nation came about supernaturally. So he said, you'll be a peculiar treasure above all the peoples, for the earth, all the earth is mine. So he says that to them. In Exodus 33:16, he says here, again speaking to their uniqueness and their individuality as far as nation being a nation is concerned. He says, for wherein shall it be known here that I and the people have found grace in your sight, Moses said. Is it not alone that you go with us? And that was one of the reasons that we're special. It says, so we shall be separated, I and thy people, from all the peoples that are upon the face of the earth. Moses said that to God. He says, we're different. We're different because you're with us. We're different because we're covenanted to you. We're different, and we're not like any of the nations in the world. This is a piece of real estate that you have in this nation that has come about by faith are God's crown, the example of nations on the planet. So at that particular time, when all these nations were set up, in this particular region, that's sort of what it looked like. All of these nations, there were many little nations around the place, and they all had their boundaries and their geography, and they were hemmed in by mountains or rivers or whatever. And some of them are highlighted. And down in the far corner there, you see the Persians, the nation of Persia. It was just a small little, domain of people. And you can see Babylon there, the yellow one. Babylonia was just a small little gathering of people who spoke that language and were unique from the others because they were Babylonian and lived in that region. Above them in the pink, you see the Medes. These go on to be the Medo-Persian Empire. I'm just mentioning Persian because they're small a demographic at this moment in time. They're small groups, and that's the way God had put them. And intended them to stay like that, per se. He put them in their boundaries. And up here in the blue, you see Assyria. Assyria is just a small group of people. In fact, it looks like it's even smaller than Israel was meant that it was going to be. It's a small group of peoples, and this is where Assyria was. And so there's different ones. These were different nations. Egypt over here was just So this was sort of the way the nations were. Nobody had predominance. Nobody had ideas of ruling the world. And God had put all these nations out there. There were 70 of them when Lot came out, when Noah came out of the ark, and his 3 sons and their daughters, Japheth, Ham, and Shem. 17 nations, they split, and 17 nations come out of their lineages. Japheth went to the north, Shem stayed around the Middle East, and Ham went to Africa. And so we see all the nations come back to these 3 guys, but that's sort of where they stem from. Now, again, God had kept this piece of real estate. Other people were living in it because Israel hadn't showed up yet. Abraham hadn't showed up yet. So there's nothing really going on there. There's no real name. Palestine is what it's going to get called. But as you can see, everything's small. There's no great dominance, empires, or anything. Now God told Israel here in this piece of real estate, it belongs to me. And so when Israel did show up and eventually start to occupy this piece of real estate, God told them, this is mine. And if you don't comply to the rules and regulations of being tenants on my property, I'm going to put you off. And so last week we talked about in Leviticus 26, God, in verse 14 through the end, God started to speak to the children of Israel about national decline, how a nation ends up declining into oblivion, really. And so he tells them, if you don't listen to the word, or if you discard what I say, or if you start to bring in other gods, and so on and so forth, and he gives them 6 or so steps into that decline. If you don't do this, this will happen. And then if you still don't do it, this will happen. And if you still don't do either of them, this will happen. And if you still don't do any of them, this will happen. And so we read Leviticus chapter 26 last week, and we saw these particular steps, these cycles of judgment. These cycles of judgment progress from sickness and terror down to dispersion, where the nation get taken and totally get taken away altogether. And this is exactly what's going to happen to Israel. Although God had intended for them to be the diadem, the crown of nations, they themselves they wanted a king to be like other nations in the world. Remember that? They went to Samuel and said, we want a king just like the other nations. And Samuel sort of said, God said, don't worry about it, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. They wanted to be like everybody around them. And then they started to water themselves down with their walk with God. And as they did, over time, these things started to happen to the children. It happens to every nation on the planet if they deal with God this way. This is what will happen in every nation. It's basically, these are the cycles of any nation's decline. But in particular, this was what he's telling them about their walk with him, Israel's connection with him. And so as they start to go down this over decades and hundreds of years, as they start to go down this journey of decline, God starts to take the boundaries off of the nations that were round about them. God starts to lift the confinement on these other nations. So Israel starts to decline and other nations start to rise up now. And all part of God's plan, they start to rise up and start to have ideas of running more than their own little country. And apart from the skirmishes that they had, people infringing on each other or not liking each other, which were just national things, nobody ever had this idea to occupy more than themselves until Israel started to decline and then other nations started to rise. And we see the rise of empires simply because Israel started to lose its position. Then the Gentiles started to rise up and fill in the gaps and a desire to be the nation or the empire of the world. So we're placing Israel, if you understand what I'm saying, spiritually. Everybody with me? So, this was what started to happen in Leviticus chapter 26. Now, when this was happening, you can see that the Babylonian Empire there is small, and Assyria is small. These are all little. Egypt was probably the bigger one, had more influence, okay, up the coast and up into the Hittites. up north. And that was because they were there a long, long time, a very powerful bunch of people. They had a lot of emphasis, but they weren't nation building. They were just Egypt had influence along the coast because of trade. So they were all small. But when Israel started to decline, this ambition in others to rise up and be the predominant nation spiritually was really what was going on. But physically, and then this little nation here, the green one, Assyria, it had aspirations of being great. It had skirmishes with others, but eventually it took over others. And before you know it, the first empire we see on the planet, really, because Israel's on the decline, the first empire we see is Assyria. And so this little green crowd up here eventually take over all of this, including Egypt and Israel. Israel had, in their decline, they had split into two nations, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. They were falling out with each other at this stage. And eventually Assyria came down and took the northern tribe, the 10 tribes, captive. Whatever. Remember all that story? You would have bogged you down on it, but that's what happened. And Assyria didn't take Judah. There was a reason for that. It didn't take them, it actually took rent from them, is what it did. But it took the northern 10 tribes. When Assyria was coming down this way, they came as far as the northern kingdoms of Israel. And the king, Sargon, he took the 10 tribes and he took them captive. He led them out of it, but he stopped when something happened and he had to return. He just didn't go any further. He went down to Judah. Later on, when he died, another Assyrian king called Sennacherib, you remember him, he shows up. He starts his aspirations. So he comes back down again, and when he comes to Judah, he puts an army outside the door of Jerusalem. Do you remember that story? And Sennacherib surrounds Jerusalem, and that night the angel of the Lord killed 185,000. He thought, I'll leave that place alone. And so Sennacherib left Judah. He never touched it. He was afraid of his life, and he didn't tell why. That's why Judah remained for another 120 years. Even though the northern kingdom had been taken captive, Judah hadn't. They were afraid of him. God was still there. And so they came down and they captured Egypt and whatever. They took rent from Judah, but they were afraid to touch it because it hadn't fully declined yet. Isaiah prophesied to them and told them, you don't watch yourselves, this is what's going to happen, and so on and so forth. But Israel's on the decline, and Assyria takes that prominence. And that's what happened. The northern tribes went off into captivity due to this. Now, in the meanwhile, Babylon over here, and then the Media up there, Babylon sort of wasn't against Assyria. They were sort of friends of and allowed Assyria to be dominant. But they started to have aspirations of their own. And so they joined together with the Medes that crowd up in the north there, and they became friends. And they thought, you know what, let's get rid of the Assyrians. And so the Babylonians had this aspiration of getting rid of the Assyrians. And so they go to war against the Assyrians. And they befriend the Medes, and they help them. And so between the two of them, they go in and take Assur, and then they push the Midianites, the Assyrians, right up into the northern part here, okay, up by Syria. So they push them up there. And here's what Assyria did. Assyria asked Egypt for help. Now, they weren't the best of friends at all. But Egypt thought, well, you know what? If we go up and help them, maybe we'll get some land too. Maybe we'll broaden our horizons. And so they had a king, a young king, called Pharaoh Necho. You don't have to remember this. Just this is who he was. History tells all this. This guy called Pharaoh Necho, he's a young pharaoh, and he decides, hey, absolutely, I will. I'll head on up the coast here. I'll take my army, I'll join the Assyrians, and we'll beat back the Babylonians and their friends, and I'll gain some land and some territory and some spoils as well, because Assyria offered them spoils. So in his greed, Pharaoh Necho heads up the coast. On his journey, by the way, he meets the king of Judah on his travels, and the king of Judah doesn't know whether he's going to attack him or not, so he goes out and meets him in the plains of Megiddo, and says to Pharaoh Necho, "Hey, where are you going?" And he says, "Well, we're going up to Assyria." He goes, "No, I don't think you are. I think you're coming against me." And Pharaoh says, you've no dog in this fight. I'm going to have Assyria fight the Babylonians, so just move aside and let me go." He wouldn't move. And so they had a battle there, which delayed Pharaoh from getting up to help the Assyrians, which helped the Assyrians get beat. But he fights the Judah there in the battle in the valley of Megiddo, and Josiah the king is killed. The waste of time, he should have even gone out and conquered, but he dies. Pharaoh Necho heads on up and they join Assyria, and they get beaten at a very famous battle called the Battle of Carchemish. Real famous battle. It's the turning point in global history. And so Pharaoh Necho and the Assyrians are beaten at Carchemish. Big battle. And the Babylonians not alone beat them up there at Carchemish, but they decided to chase the Egyptians the whole way back to Egypt. That's how victorious they were. And killed everybody on the run. Got them all. And ended up that these Babylonians not only beat the Assyrians, but in their pursuit of the Egyptians, they ended up the whole way down in Egypt, which meant they passed Jerusalem on the way. Now the guy leading that army was a guy called Nebuchadnezzar. He was a Babylonian. He wasn't the king at that stage, his dad was, but he was the crown prince. And so he's Babylonian, and he meets the Syrians up in Carchemish, and he fights them, and Pharaoh Necho beats the tar out of them. They all head running, and he chases after them, chases them the whole way down the coastline, and the whole way back to Egypt. And on the way down, he passes Jerusalem. He thinks, I must go back and visit that place on the way back. On the way back, he surrounds Jerusalem. And while he's surrounding them with the plan to destroy them, his father dies back in Babylon. And so being the crown prince, he has to leave to go back to receive the crown. But to show the people what he was doing and to keep a quiet on what he was doing, he told his officers to take about 100 of the family, the kids of the nobility that are in Jerusalem, take them back to Babylon. Therefore, everybody in Babylon will know how far I got. They'll know what I've conquered. And I'll have all of these kids that are from Jerusalem, and I'm going to train them in the Chaldean way, or the Babylonian way, in the Chaldean way. And eventually, I'll send them back, and they'll govern for me with Chaldean mentality. You understand what he was doing? So he couldn't stay. He wasn't there that long. But he insisted that they take, and they took about 100 kids with them. And I say kids, in their teens. Among those kids were Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All right? These were the kings and the princes of Israel. These were their kids. So they thought, if we take the kids, they're never going to attack us. We'll always have them like in the hostage scenario, but we'll take them to Babylon, and I'll train them. And I'll show them that Babylon is far better than where they came from. And eventually, they'll come back here and they'll make Jerusalem a small Babylon type of thing. That was the way he run it. So Nebuchadnezzar goes back to Babylon to get his crown. He's going to come back another couple of times because there are enough ahead of themselves in Jerusalem, even though he has the kids over there. And eventually he's going to take the whole batch. He's going to take about 20,000 of them back to Babylon, and he's going to leave the poorest there. It's called the diaspora. Who mentioned that? Martin. Yes, somebody mentioned the diaspora. That was the leftovers, the poorest of the people. He left them there during the dispersal. But all of the noble people, all of the kings, all of the princes, all of their families, their in-laws, outlaws, kids, grandkids, cousins, and all of the smart people, all of the educated, and all of the skilled people. He took them away and left the poor people on their own. And he took them all about. So he comes down 3 times. The first time he took Daniel and the other kids. He comes down again, and they're not behaving themselves. And he takes a batch. He takes about 10,000 away with him. And he takes all the stuff out of the temple. Takes all that stuff away, all the goblets and all of the gold and whatever. And then he comes back another time, and he eventually destroys the whole city. 8-year periods. He just destroys everything. And he takes whatever he wants, burns the city, knocks the walls, and he goes back to Babylon. And they spend 17 years in captivity. All of the story so far. Okay. Isaiah warned them. Isaiah told that this would happen. Long before Babylon or even Assyria were the main guys on the block. And so when Isaiah told them this, they couldn't believe it, because Babylon, for goodness sake, Assyria is the main kid in town. But he told them Babylon's coming. So Isaiah said this. Isaiah said unto Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the day is come, that all that is in thine house, and that which thy fathers have laid up in store until this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, saith the Lord. And of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. They would have thought, what? Babylon's not even worth talking about. But God knew what was going to happen. And so he prophesied that to them. So Babylon and the Medes, who were their friends, basically take over the whole of what Assyria had. They beat them, they beat Pharaoh Necho, and they end up with this sort of Babylonian empire, purple in color. Now what you see is basically that the Assyrians, when they had it, was further north. But you see the Mede, they took the northern part of what was the Assyrian Empire, and Babylon took the southern part. So they sort of split between them. You get me? When Assyria had it, they had north and south. But when Babylon came in, they beat them, but they gave the northern part of it to the Medes. And that was the way it sort of. So they became the new kid on the block, and the Babylonian Empire. And I put up there that circle there, that's where the Battle of Carchemish, just by the river Euphrates, that's where that battle took place. Very, very famous historical battle. It was a turning point of empires, really. And so it's a very famous battle. And so that's where the battle took place, and chasing the whole way down. So Babylon now are running things under a guy called Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, and he has a small dynasty, and it ends up with Belshazzar. But eventually we're going to find out that the Medes over there and the Persians down at the bottom, they decide, hey, we're fed up with the Babylonians. And so they get together and they move in and they defeat the Babylonians, and the Medo-Persians become the new kid on the block. Are you with me? So all this is going on over in this part of the Old Testament.
How do you spell Carchemish?
C-A-R-C-H-A-M-I-S-H. Carchemish.
Thank you.
So, and you should look it up in history. It's a very famous battle. Huge battle with enormous losses at Carchemish. And I should put Babylon in there to show you where the geographics were. And so everybody with the picture so far. So you can see now Israel is declining. Assyria rises up. Assyria now becomes a big kid on the block, whereas Israel was supposed to be the nation of nations. Assyria now builds an empire, takes the 10 northern tribes of Israel into captivity, and then later on Babylon comes in and it becomes a kid on the block, and it takes the rest of them away. So now we have these nations. We have the Assyrians, now we have the Babylonians, then the Babylonian Empire was run by Nebuchadnezzar, and I don't even want to say the name, Nabopolassar. He was his father, And then there's Nebuchadnezzar, and then there's, I'm not going to give it to them. and I'll tell you why, because I love history. I would love to do a series where I run you right from the first kings, the whole way through, all of their history, and all of the kings, both for Israel and for Judah, and tell you what was going on with the Medo-Persian, because I mentioned all over then First Chronicles, Second Chronicles, First Kings, Second Kings would all start to make sense. You'll see what was going on during this time, because that's what all those books are about. First Kings, Second Kings, and Chronicles are all about this, naming all of these names. Oh, stupid names. It's just the history of what was going on. But when you go into that, these people, if you're not historically inclined, it's just a mishmash of facts, figures, and dates. So, Nebuchadnezzar, the main guy, he's running the show, okay? Everybody with me so far? Simple enough?
One question.
Yeah.
In that area that's Israel, when Israel went there, when Abraham got there, was anybody occupying it besides the ites?
Yes. No,
Just the ites.
The ites were everywhere. And he had to come in, and he became so prosperous. The guy was owned everything, bought everything, and he just prospered. God bless him. And watch. Sodom and Gomorrah was there, and all these other cities were there. But you know the story. So yes, there was other people there, but they occupied it as they grew. Okay? Everybody else okay?
Question.
Yeah.
If you go back to slide, please. If Egypt sided with Assyria, why didn't Babylonia go into Egypt?
They did actually.
Oh,
They did, yeah.
Okay.
They did. Babylon sort of run. I have this here because, again, they sort of paid rent for a wee while.
Okay.
And because he conquered it, but he didn't. He sort of had a vassal state.
That answered it.
The problem was later on they rose up again, and you don't need to. And it's just another rabbit hole. But he did. All of this was Babylon. They ran the whole show. And so Nebuchadnezzar now takes the place of his father, chasing after the Egyptians, give him this portion of land. They give the northern part to the Medes, to Media, and he rules from Babylon. He takes all of these kids back to Babylon, and later on he takes 10,000. Later on he takes another batch too, and he robs Israel or Jerusalem of their brains, so their brain drain, and he leaves the poor people there. And it wasn't for another 70 years until the Medo-Persian Empire under Cyrus decided to oust him out, that Cyrus came along and said, oh, well, you can all go back. And we're going to find out that when Cyrus did that, it was because the Jews showed Cyrus' name in the book hundreds of years before he ever lived. And so they took the book and said, hey, by the way, your name's in the book. And they said, really? Yeah, your name's here. He goes, what? And so they open the book and he reads it and goes, oh, I think, no, I don't want to fall out with your God because he says great things about me, so you just can all go back. Alexander the Great, when he came down, when the Grecian Empire came down, Alexander the Great came and surrounded Jerusalem. And the priests in Jerusalem took the book of Daniel and went out to Alexander the Great and said, here, just before you kill us all, I'm just going to show you, you're in the book. And then he went, what? And they said, yeah. And so he goes through the book and he shows him, and Alexander says, well, I ain't going to touch this. And that's why Alexander the Great didn't conquer Israel. He just didn't do it because their God mentioned him in the book of Daniel. And he thought, well, I'm not going against it. I've still a lot to do according to the prophecy. And so this is how powerful this book is. And history is written in it. So, Nebuchadnezzar, one of the closenesses they had with the Medes was he married the princess from Media. Her name was Antichrist. And you've often heard of the 7 wonders of the world. Anybody tell me what one of the 7 wonders of the world were in Babylon?
Hanging gardens.
The Garden of Babylon.
Right.
Now, we don't have them today, they're not there, but history tells us about them. And this is an artist's impression of what the hanging gardens of Babylon were like. It was spectacular. And the reason for it apparently was Nebuchadnezzar married a mistress. She was the princess of the Medes. And to sort of have a bond between the two, so they wouldn't fall out with each other, which they did, but not during his reign, but to solidify that. So he married a mistress, and the Medes lived in the mountains, and she loved the mountains, apparently. History, the Babylonian documents tell us. She loved the mountains, but where Babylon was as flat as pancake. And he loved her that much that he built a mountain. He built a mountain, and he planted the trees and the gardens on it for her. And it was called one of the seven wonders of the world because it was so spectacular, so beautiful, and it stood out in the middle of nowhere. All of this thing with all of these gardens and trees and plants that rose up in a sort of small mountain. And it was Nebuchadnezzar who built the hanging gardens of Babylon for his wife, Amycus, from Midian. So, just a little bit of history, but that's where all that.
What have you done for Lucy like that?
I'm just waiting to get the property. When I get the property, have the house, I'll build whatever she wants.
She's still waiting.
We're working on it. So, after Babylon, then these other crowds are going to come. We're going to talk about that later on in the series. But the Medo-Persian Empire then come along. They have all this, and then eventually they're going to take over the red one here, which is Babylon as well. So the Medo-Persian Empire is going to take it. So it's get bigger again. And then we're going to find out that the Grecians come in and they get bigger and bigger again. And then we're going to find out that the Romans come in and they take not just that, but then they go around the top of it, North Africa. So it just gets bigger and bigger. Every one of them just multiplies on the red. So we're going to end up with all these empires. The reason they're in place, the reason the Gentiles are predominant is what?
Son of Israel.
Because Israel aren't. Israel have declined, split into two, lost the top 10 nations, the other 3 go into captivity, and so while they're not predominant, all these other nations now started jockeying for position. Until Israel come back. When Israel come back, they're still under rule, then the Grecians are over them, then the Romans are over them, and would you believe it or not, in 70 AD, after Jesus died and rose again, in 70 AD, the Romans come in and take them all away again, because they did the same thing again. And they get dispersed all over the world for the next 2,000 years, and they don't come back until 1948. That's when they all come back again. So you know God's doing something when you see them all coming back to this piece of real estate. And then Israel starts to rise up, and right now, if you look at the world geographically, and if you look at it politically, everything that's going on is revolved around whether you're friends with or enemies of Israel. Iran are against them, and China with Iran, and Russia with Iran, and America's with Israel, and England's with Israel, and that, and that. And everybody's all gathering around this, isn't it? Because God is bringing this nation back up again. It's not there yet. And God will eventually bring this nation up, and He will restore it. But that restoration is called the millennial kingdom. That's what they're looking for. That's why when Jesus came and said the kingdom is at hand, they all thought, oh, God's going to put us right back where we belong. The preeminent nation on the planet. He will do that, but He'll do that at the millennial kingdom. So, from this event here, where they're taken captive, until the millennial kingdom, they never really ever become, they just are not the predominant nation on the world. That's why the world now, this whole period is called the time of the Gentiles in Scripture, in the book of Luke 21. It's called the time of the Gentiles. Why? Because Israel are not the key nation at the moment. Does that make sense to everybody? Nobody confused? Simple? You believe how hard it was to make that simple.
You did a great job. We did.
That's where we're at. And that's what goes on here.
And now today's lesson.
And the Persian Empire, as I said, took all of this. It took it all. So they came in and took all of this. They were growing up in North Africa. And then we're going to find the Grecian Empire would come in and take that, then the Roman Empire would come in and take them, and then the Roman Empire would disperse. And this is where we are today. But the Antichrist is going to start coming up again. And there will be a reformation of the Roman nation, the Roman Empire, and the Antichrist is going to come out of that. And that's going to come from Daniel as well. All with me.
You said that was the Roman Empire? You said the
Revised Roman Empire.
Revised.
Okay.
It won't be all of those nations, but it'll be some of them. Some of them will be revised. 10. All right. All good, okay. Jeremiah 46 and verse 1. The word of the Lord which came to Jeremiah the prophet. And Jeremiah kept telling them again and again and again, Babylon's going to eat your lunch. They said, no, Babylon aren't the kids. Jeremiah kept telling them, you're going to eat your lunch. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet against the Gentiles, against Egypt, against the army of Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, which was by the river Euphrates in Carchemish, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, smote in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Joash, the king of Judah. I just thought I'd bring it to you. So you think I wasn't making it up. All right? This is back, and he told them in advance this is going to happen. And here's the names, here's the battle, here's the characters. And it's all there. It's all, we often wonder what all them books are about. It's all about this. Okay? And here's another version. This is in 2 Chronicles 35. It says, and all of this, and when Josiah was prepared and had prepared the temple, Necho, or Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish by the Euphrates. And Josiah went out to meet him. And he sent an ambassador to him, saying, what have I to do with thee, thou king of Judah? I have not come against you today, but against the house wherewith I have war. For God commanded me to make haste, forbear thee from meddling with God, who is with me, that he destroy thee not. In other words, step out of the way, Josiah. I will go up here and help the Assyrians in this battle. Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself that he might fight with him, and hearkened not unto the words of Necho, Pharaoh Necho, from the mouth of God, and came to fight in the valley of Megiddo. And here's the story. Read the story. He gets hit with an arrow, and they transport him from his chariot to another chariot, take him away, but he dies. And then his son takes over, Jehoiakim, and that's the guy who's there when Nebuchadnezzar surrounds the city for the first time. He takes Daniel and all the guys. But I just wanted to show you, when you go back to these books, you'll find all these stories are in there. That's what you're reading. In case you ever thought, why am I reading? What's First Kings, Second Kings? What's First Chronicles, Second Chronicles? What's that all about? It's telling you the transformation of Israel going from this key nation and their demise, and the other nations of the world start to come up. That's all. That's all that's about.
Is that Second Chronicles historical or prophetic?
That's set, see again?
Is that history or prophecy?
That's the Chronicles. Chronicles. They wrote down what happened. So it's Chronicles. The history of Israel and their demise and the rises of it. So that's Chronicles. Yeah.
In 35:21 it says, for God commanded me. That was the Egyptian talking, right?
That was Pharaoh Necho. He was of the opinion that God told him, and I think it was Greek told him to go up, and because they weren't friends with the Syrian. He was ambitious. He was really a young Pharaoh, and a lot of testosterone, thought he could take on the world, and headed up that way, saying God told him. His God went and told him, but he told Josiah to step out of the way. Josiah wouldn't. So, but that delay, the fight in Josiah, was one of the reasons that the Assyrians were really on the back foot when he got there, because the Babylonians and the Medes had really pushed him over to Carchemish. They were destroying them, and then he arrived, but when he arrives it's too late, and he arrives to his own demise and defeat. Everybody okay? All right. Yes.
Why did Josiah go so far north to leave Israel?
Josiah didn't go north.
Did he not go to?
No, he didn't go to that battle. Pharaoh Necho was coming from Egypt, going up the coast to Carchemish, which is way north of Judah. And so you see an army coming towards you,
Right.
you automatically sound the alarm and you set your army in readiness, and Josiah was out and said, what's the deal? And he said, oh, we're just passing, we're just going up to fight with the Assyrians. No, I don't think so. But okay, if you're going to fight, I'm going, that's where I'm going, and he wouldn't believe him. And so they ended up having a battle and in the plains of Megiddo, just outside Jerusalem, and he loses. But Pharaoh Necho was not interested in Jerusalem, he still got to go to a battle. So after he beats Josiah, he then heads on up and he arrives late. And that delay is what caused them their defeat. All right, let me move on here. I'll never get to that. Okay. 2 Chronicles 36:6. Against him came up Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and bound him with fetters to carry him to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried
Now, who's the him?
Sorry?
Who's the him?
It's the king. It's the king of Jehoiakim.
Jehoiakim, okay.
Take Jehoiakim away. And again he came to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, bound him in fetters, and carried him to Babylon. One of the things that they did back then was they collected kings. So when you raised an empire, what you did was you collect kings on your escapades. And that's what he did. He eventually takes Jehoiakim and he takes him back to Babylon. He gouges out his eyes and he sort of has him as a trophy. So every so often when they were having a banquet, he'd drag out 10 or 15 kings that were all bound, and they'd all come out of the dungeons and he'd trail them along and he'd stand in the background and he'd eat his lunch while all the other guests would look up and see all of the kings that he had conquered. And then what he would do is he'd take their children and their kids and he'd take them and he'd train them the Babylonian ways so that they'd go back to their vassal estates with the Babylonian cavalry set of life. Everybody with me? They were empire. I'm just putting these up to show you all of this stuff this evening. Okay? So when you ever read the books, you say, well, what's that all about? And sometimes you read them alone and think, and I understand why you would. There's no need to go there unless you just want to understand the history of Israel and how God was still dealing with them through that time. In Ezekiel chapter 30, verse 10, for thus saith the Lord, I will also make the multitude of Egypt to cease by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And he and his people with him, and the terror of the nations shall be brought to destroy the land. And they shall draw their swords against Egypt and fill the land with the slain. That was that battle from Carchemish. He comes down and fights them. Okay? And Ezekiel talks about what had happened. And that's just it. So, with all of that said, and I just put that up to show you that all of that was going on at the time. Everybody with me? So now we're going to the book of Daniel.
Yay!
So, when we get to the book of Daniel, you understand what's going on. There's empire building going on around. The Syrians have already been the kids on the block. Now the new kids on the block are the Babylonians under this king called Nebuchadnezzar. He's a crown prince at this stage, but he eventually he has to go back and take the crown because his father died, but he demands that one of his guys arrest and take about 100 kids with him, of which Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were part of that. So, if you want to go to the book of Daniel yourselves, I had planned to do all of this in 15 minutes. And get into the book of Daniel this morning. But listen, once you understand the narrative, this will all make sense then as we go through.
And we appreciate you taking the time and not going so fast we couldn't get it. We went slow enough that we got it, so we appreciate the time.
Yes, we do.
It just makes the book a little bit more. It's
Easier
not
to digest when we get here. It's going to make a lot more sense.
and the book's not foreign. Every time we talk about something, it makes it a little bit more palatable. Oh, okay, all right. I get what those books are about now. Well, First and Second Chronicles. Oh, okay. I mean, who's referring back to Chronicles for something? There are things in Chronicles that God is doing, but how many of you hear quotes from Chronicles? But they're very important. because it's dealing with all of this stuff that's going on, the demise of a nation and the rise of empires. Okay? And God is in the middle of it all, because He's making sure it all goes right. Okay? All right. So, it says here in chapter 1 and verse 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Jehoiakim is Joash, Josiah's son. Josiah died. Pharaoh Necho killed him. Remember, he interfered, and Pharaoh Necho killed him, so this guy now becomes the king. It says here, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, on to Jerusalem and besieged it. This is on his way back from chasing Pharaoh Necho down the coast. Conquers Egypt, he's on his way back, and he set siege to Babylon, or to Jerusalem. It says, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, which is Babylon, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Okay? Belshazzar later on was going to have a party and use all of these vessels that night. But anyway, it says in verse 3, and the king spake unto Aspenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, well favored, skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Now, this is when they take Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar heads back then to get his crown from his now deceased dad. But this guy is told to go and take kids, prince's kids. They're not just any kids, they're smart kids. They're handsome kids. I probably would have been paid. Lucy definitely would have been the first choice. But he had demanded to take it. But no, they were looking for, handsome, intelligent, smart kids. But not just, they had to have the wherewithal. Because Babylon was they had a very intelligent society. They had engineers and scientists and astrologers, and they had all this sort of science going on. So they didn't want kluxes. They wanted people that they could train. And so they take these guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they take them. Now there's more of them, but these four stand up. Now Daniel stood out long before he was ever taken into captivity. Before they were actually taken into captivity, the prophet who spoke to them, to Judah at that, was two prophets. One of them was Jeremiah, and the other one was Ezekiel. They both spoke into Judah at that time, telling them Babylon's coming, watch yourselves. Ezekiel is a prophet that has a Bible study like this one among the nobles' kids, because he thought, something's coming, but I got to teach these people the ways of God. So he has a Bible study, whether you realize it or not. So in Ezekiel chapter 14, in his book, Ezekiel not alone has a Bible study and has these kings in his Bible study. But later on, Daniel and them, they get taken into Babylon, and some 8, maybe 16 years later, when Nebuchadnezzar was down the last time to knock the walls and everything, Ezekiel is taken with him. So Ezekiel ends up in Babylon, and he prophesies to the nation of Israel while they're in Babylon. He sees wheels within wheels, and he sees all of this, all of the hope that they're going to get out of here and cause them to be established. All right? This is Ezekiel 14. So they're still in Judah at this time, and they're having a Bible study. So it says here, then came certain of the elders of Israel unto me, sat before me. Now this is not the king, these are all his kids. These are all the prince's kids, cousins. Then come certain of the elders of Israel unto me, and sat before me, and the word of the Lord came unto me, saying. So they're all sitting before him, he's talking to them, he's teaching them whatever it is. and the Spirit of God comes over him. And then he says something quite peculiar. He goes on to say, and the word of the Lord came unto me again, saying, Son of man, when the land sinneth against me by trespassing grievously, then will I stretch out my hand upon it. I will break the staff of the bread. Remember I told you all these different things that happen. I'll break the staff of the bread thereof. I will send famine upon it, and I will cut off man and beast from it. Though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they should deliver but their own souls by their righteousness, saith the Lord God. So at the having the Bible study, Daniel's there. I know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're all there. And as he's teaching, the Spirit of God comes on and says, hey, there's a day coming when I'm going to stretch my hand out across this whole land. And it's going to be that bad, I can tell you. There's only three people could get through what's about to happen. One of them would have been Noah. Noah went through a very troublous time. Remember that whole story. Building the ark and preaching, nobody listening. And he kept himself in that time of disaster. Another guy that's mentioned and that they hold high esteem is a guy called Job. Job was covered in sores, and yet he still wouldn't curse God, and God favored him, and he ended up twice as much as he did when he started. Remember that whole story? He said there's only a couple of people in our history that had that wherewithal to be able to withstand a judgment. And he says, I can only name three, God said, through the prophet. One of them would be Noah. Another one would be Job. And another one would be that kid over there, Daniel. I'm sure everybody's going, what? Yeah, that guy there. Little did they know that later on we're all going to be taken, but God's now telling the guy, you're special. He doesn't stop there, he keeps talking. And if a noisome beasts to pass, if I cause no noisome beasts to pass through the land, and they spoil it, so that it becomes desolate, that no man may pass through because of the beast, though these three men were in it, as I live, said the Lord, they shall deliver neither sons nor daughters, they only shall be delivered, but the land will be desolate. Again, he's pointing to Daniel saying, what's about to happen, the only guy who's going to come through this is that guy over there. He has the wherewithal to do it. Verse carries on. Or if I bring a sword upon that land and say, sword, go through the land, so that I cut off man and beast from it. Though these three men were in it, as I live, said the Lord of hosts, they shall deliver neither sons nor daughters, but they only shall be delivered themselves. He's not finished. Or if I send pestilence onto the land, and pour out my fury upon it in blood, and cut off from it man and beast, though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, as I live, said the Lord, they shall deliver neither son nor daughter, they shall but deliver their own souls by their righteousness. Ezekiel is now taking this one individual kid in his Bible study before Babylon ever show up, and he basically says, well, what's about to happen? And it's going to happen. I told you all the things are those the depravity of Israel going down into desolation. He said there's only one guy in this room that'll come through. Only one guy in this room has the wherewithal to stay righteous in this whole thing. He says that kid over there. Daniel knew this. Daniel knew this when he was being taken. When they came and took Daniel, Daniel knows all this. He was pulled out of the class. They'd stand up and say, you know, these people go to these meetings for a prophecy. So just call me out. Somebody calls me in front of everybody and tells me I'm going to rule the world and I'm going to trap the world. I mean, what else is prophecy? But Daniel wasn't looking for it, but I'll tell you, Ezekiel said, dude, there's the guy there. He had no idea what's coming, but when it does, there's the guy there. The only one in this class that can do it. All right? He mentions it again in Ezekiel 28. We talk about, remember we talked about the Antichrist, we talked about Satan over in Ezekiel 28:14, he talks about he was made up of all different things, he was eating the garden of God, and he was called the king of Tyrus. And then he brings up a lamentation against the prince of Tyre. So brought up how he's the type of the Antichrist. But here's this type of the Antichrist. The Son of Man, say this against the prince of Tyre, thus saith the Lord, because thine heart is lifted up, and you said, I am a God, and I sit in the seat of God in the midst of the seas, yet you are a man, you are not God. Though you said your heart has the heart of God, behold, you are wiser than Daniel. So he compares Daniel and the Antichrist here as well. So this is the Antichrist he's talking about. He said he couldn't be as smart as Daniel was. Daniel was very smart. Daniel was able to know things that other people didn't know. All with me?
So in that, in 8:2, is that talking about the Antichrist?
Say that what?
Is verse 2 talking about the Antichrist?
Yeah.
The son of Tyrus is referring to the Antichrist.
Yes. Remember I told you the relationship from a prince
Yeah,
to
I
a
just
king?
wanted to make sure I was going with the Antichrist and not a literal historical fulfillment.
The Antichrist. Everybody what we said? Just trying to set us up now for next week. Back to the book of Daniel. Daniel's names were changed. And Daniel became known as Belteshazzar. They changed their names to Chaldean names, okay? So, but here's what Daniel said. This is a very important verse. Because when Daniel was in captivity, Daniel knows God's hands on his life. Please remember that. He knows God's word. Ezekiel told, as the Bible studied before. It never happened. So it says here, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Remember that whole story? He didn't want to eat the meat from the table of the king, although they were pulled into that very special place. They got to live in the king's palace, got to eat the king's food, drink the king's wine, because he was going to train them. They're very intelligent, they're very smart. We're going to go on for a 3-year program to learn. But Daniel said, I don't eat that food because it's off to idols, and I just don't want to do it because God has his hand in my life. So you know the story. The eunuch says, I can't do that. If you get skinny, I get killed. He said, no, all I want is fruit and vegetables. He goes, give me fruit and vegetables, I'll be fine. So he and some others, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they eat vegetables for 10 days, and eventually when the eunuch comes in and looks at Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're healthier looking than all the other guys. So he says, fine, you're on veggies from now on in. And then 3 years later, Nebuchadnezzar calls these guys in to see what they've learned. Okay? So let's go down to, and I'll close with this. And go to verse 19. Sorry, go back to verse 17. Does somebody want to read verse 17 through 21?
What chapter are we in?
We were in chapter 2 still. Oh, sorry, chapter 1.
To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Hezekiah, or
Azariah.
So they entered the king's service, and every manner of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus.
So, the king calls the guys in, said, let's see how smart they are. God had taught them for the 3 years. And so, in verse 19, when the king communed with them and found that there was none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There was none like him. Therefore, they stood before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding, the king inquired, and he found them to be 10 times smarter than anybody he had. And the Bible says in verse 21, Daniel continued even on to the first year of King Cyrus. Daniel was on for the next 70 years to influence what's going on. When Cyrus comes along, Daniel was about 19 years of age. He was 19. Daniel is a statesman. Phenomenal guy. God's hand was on him. But for 70 years, this guy is going to influence what's going on. Typical of God. Although one totally gets destroyed over here and the nation goes into desolation, when they go into captivity, who do you think is going to be looking after them in captivity? Who's going to be the prime minister looking after them? One of their own. God already took Daniel in advance, put Daniel in a place so that even though God's people would end up in Babylon, God was going to have one of his own men take care of them for 70 years over there. Daniel does that job. Daniel takes care of Israel while they're in captivity. He influences all the kings to make sure that the Israelites are preserved during that period of time. We're going to go into chapter 2 next week, and this king Nebuchadnezzar is going to have a dream. And that's going to be the start of this prophecy in history that we're going to take up in the coming days. Any questions?
Just as a curiosity, did Jeremiah live long enough was he still living while Daniel was there, of course, but how did that sequence of lives, because they didn't intersect in the books as I read them.
What happened was Daniel, who prophesied to them that Babylon was coming, and Daniel was called a crying prophet, because that's all he talked about. And when he became
He was called the what?
the crying prophet,
Oh, no, it was Jeremiah called the weeping prophet.
You
yeah,
said
Jeremiah.
that.
I said Daniel, so I meant Jeremiah.
Yes.
We're talking about Jeremiah. I got it
I
wrong.
was talking
Yeah, but you
I was talking about the two being sequenced because
Who,
Daniel was
the
taken
question again, remind me.
and Jeremiah.
Where did Jeremiah fit in the timeline?
Okay. Jeremiah was again a prophet to Israel, or to Judah, but he told them again and again and again. When Jehoiakim became king, okay, and Jeremiah, and when they covenanted with Nebuchadnezzar, when they covenanted with Pharaoh Necho, with Egypt at one stage, he kept saying Babylon's coming, and the king, because they were friends with Egypt at the time, and they took Jeremiah and they put him in prison. And they wouldn't let him out because he kept telling them, Babylon's coming. And they locked him up, put him in a well, and locked him up. But he wrote, that's where he wrote the book of Jeremiah. He wrote the first 20 chapters in prison. And he gave it to one of his sidekicks called Barak. And because he couldn't go out of prison, he wrote it and gave it to Barak. And Barak, he started sharing it. And the king realized, hey, this guy's, where did he come from? And it's exactly what the other guy was saying. So, cut a long story short, he told them what was going to happen. And he eventually, when they do let him free, he ends up going to Egypt. Jeremiah went to Egypt, and Ezekiel went to Babylon during the dispersions. And Jeremiah went to Egypt, and he died in Egypt. But his prophecy to Israel was up until the dispersal. But when the dispersal happened, Jeremiah fled to Egypt. Jeremiah fled to Egypt, and Ezekiel was taken in captivity to Babylon.
He fled to Egypt, he wasn't carried to Egypt.
He went with a group to Egypt to avoid the despair, because he knew it was coming. He knew in advance what was going to happen, so he headed for Egypt, and that's where he stayed. He died in Egypt. Yes.
I guess, I forgot that thought. But who prophesied that Daniel would be like Job?
Ezekiel.
Ezekiel, okay. And didn't Ezekiel go to Babylon?
Yes, he did.
Wasn't he taken there?
He was taken there
So the
eventually.
question is, did Ezekiel die in Babylon, or was there?
Yeah,
I guess I'm trying to find out if there's any other connection again after he's
No, he writes a book.
prophesied, and then they're both there.
They're both there, prophesied about Daniel early on in his prophecies. But when he ended up in Babylon with Daniel, some years after, some 8 to 12 years after
Right.
Daniel was taken, he continues to prophesy to the nation of Israel to encourage them in captivity.
Right.
And he talks about the millennial kingdom, he talks about all of those prophecies of, you know, they're going to be ankle deep and knee deep and waist deep, and going to get into the anointing again. So he kept them all encouraged during that period of time. Ezekiel did. He prophesied to Israel in captivity. Jeremiah prophesied to them prior to captivity. But Ezekiel predominantly prophesied to them in captivity. And that was all, that was his job. His job was over. Ezra and then came back to rebuild the temple, and we don't hear any more of it.